The Flathead 45 was the heart of the Harley-Davidson WLA. That motorcycle went all over the world with our troops during World War II, kicking axes and taking names. But a Flathead 45 engine also powered a bike from a company which, at the time, had plenty of street cred and a long history with our military up to World War II. That company was Indian, or Indian Motorcycle Company. Today we are going to look at an Indian 640B and a Harley-Davidson WLA. Both of these military bikes were powered by a 45 cubic inch flathead side valve air-cooled engine. But only one of these models would be ridden in any valuable amount by U.S. troops. And although both companies had motorcycles used in our military since before World War I, by the end of World War II, one brand would become an ever-increasing in popularity household name, while the other would be, well, not as fortunate. As we become familiarized with these two bike models, we will see many similarities. One being their origin story. Neither of these bikes, well, the models that these bikes originated from, were designed with the military in mind. The 1940 Indian Sport Scout is often the model credited as being the foundation for what became the 640B. Actually, the 640B borrowed many models in Indian's quiver. The 640B was a combination of parts already used on the Indian's Junior, Sport Scout, and Chief models. And before we go any further, the B in Indian 640B stood for Battery Coil Ignition. Now, the Harley-Davidson WLA originated from the 1937 Harley-Davidson W model. The big leap forward with that bike was a recirculating oil system versus the previous total loss system. You need to remember that with the earlier total loss system, the rider is responsible for keeping the oil flow in check, adjusting the oil pump, manually pumping the oil while riding. So yeah, any sane mind at the time welcomed the new recirculating system. And the Army, on this point, was sane enough to order the 1937 Harley-Davidson WL to replace the model RL, already being ridden by our soldiers, and Japanese soldiers, and Chinese soldiers. I'll cover that story in another video. In 1939, two prototype 39 WL, somewhat militarized models, were contracted, purchased, and by August, shipped to the Mechanized Cavalry Board at Fort Knox, Kentucky, and tested there, as well as Holabird Quartermaster Depot in Baltimore, Maryland. These two prototypes were the origin for what would be the WLA model. By 1940, the Indian 640B and the Harley-Davidson WLA were in production and being purchased under government contract. In that year, 1940, the military accepted through the Detroit Ordnance Depot 656 WLA motorcycles. That's 149 more than the 507 Indian 640Bs. And that had always been the way between the two companies. The Army began experimenting with motorcycles in 1913, first taking them into combat in 1916. May have been that punitive expedition where the rivalry between these two companies began. Actually, in those early years, our military trialed motorcycles from companies like Indian, Harley-Davidson, Cleveland, and Excelsior. When the United States entered World War I in April of 1917, we brought motorcycles from several U.S. companies. Although without question, the two motorcycle companies the United States military preferred were the dry clutch models from Indian and Harley-Davidson. Indian was contracted in 1918 to supply 5,500 motorcycles. That same year, Harley-Davidson Motor Company was contracted to build 8,125 motorcycles. William Harley and the Davidson brothers had planted a seed with the military the previous year, which by 1918 was beginning to take root. But more on that later. Fiscal year 1941, the numbers become more contrasting. In that year, 2,022 Indian 640B motorcycles were accepted by the military, compared to the 4,731 Harley-Davidson WLAs that were accepted. And in 1942, there were 17,380 Harley-Davidson WLA motorcycles accepted into our military, and only 2 Indian 640Bs accepted. That's right, 2. And if you're looking for a comeback story, you're not going to find it here, because the 640B has goose eggs for the rest of the war. But why? These bikes are very similar in function and repair. If you can operate or perform maintenance on one, there is no reason you can't on the other. Both were powered by a 45 cubic inch flathead, side valve, V-twin cylinder, air-cooled motorcycle engine. This engine choice made it perfect for the military. The advantages of a side valve engine for the military in this era include simplicity, reliability, low part count, low cost, low weight, compactness, low speed power, aka torque, low mechanical engine noise, and insensitivity to low octane fuel. The cylinder angle on both of these bikes is 42 degrees. The Indian has a true displacement of 45.44 cubic inches, with a bore of 2 7/8 inches and a stroke of 3.5. The Harley has a true displacement of 45.12 cubic inches, with a bore of 2 3/4 inches and a stroke of 3 13/16 inches. Both engines in stock form were capable of around 75 miles per hour on optimal roads and conditions before topping out. The Harley could get you there a little bit faster, with the WLA producing 25 horsepower to the 640B Indian's 22. Both motorcycles were close in their miles per gallon, the Indian getting 42, a bit more than Harley's 37. But this adds up, especially when we consider the stock gas tanks of 3.5 gallons on the Indian versus the stock 3.3 gallon WLA tank. The 640B could give you a better riding range per tank with 147 miles versus 120 miles. Both engines were mated to a 3-forward speed transmission, hand shift, foot clutch, and chain final drive. Weight was about the same between the two bikes, with the Harley-Davidson WLA weighing in at 535 pounds and the Indian 640B weighing in at 537 pounds. Both had a recommended carrying capacity of 200 pounds. Both bikes were capable of carrying that weight and full load up a 60-degree grade. Ground clearance for the 640B was 5 inches, compared to the 4-inch clearance for the WLA. But the fording depth is where the WLA is going to make up for that lost inch, with a fording depth of 18 inches versus Indian's 11 inches. Both bikes had skid plates, though the WLA had one, which was more protective and durable. Turning radius was about equal between the two bikes, at or just under 7.5 feet. These two bikes do not seem drastically different in specs. So what gives? Why such a difference in World War II production numbers between the two bikes? From 1940 through 45, Harley-Davidson would supply the U.S. military with 23,000 WLAs. An Indian would supply only 2,531 640B motorcycles. Part of the answer may be found in support. Support from the companies and support from within the military. Enter Harley-Davidson's Quartermaster School. Began in July of 1917, this school would provide training to the U.S. Army for, you guessed it, repair and maintenance of Harley-Davidson motorcycles. It was a 3-week intensive course in motorcycles from design and manufacture to service, repair, and rebuilding. This would become Harley-Davidson's service school after World War I. This service and support maneuver by Harley-Davidson would gain favor with the military. By 1941, Harley-Davidson had streamlined training of operation and repair of motorcycles for the military. Indian would attempt to do the same, especially at Holabird, but it didn't help win Army contracts. This proverbial foot in the door that Harley-Davidson had with the Army came very much into play as World War II was approaching and definitely after the war began. And if Harley-Davidson needed a little bit more to seal the deal, I should mention the name Lieutenant John E. Harley, son of William Harley, co-founder of the company Harley-Davidson. The same Lieutenant Harley, beginning in 1942, was the director of the motorcycle training school at Fort Knox, Kentucky. Lieutenant Harley took the school to a more proficient training level, lengthened the school's duration in order to prepare soldiers to ride, maintain, and repair their bikes in all conditions and terrain. Lieutenant Harley also began the Fort Knox Endurance Run, a grueling endurance course that had a mandatory entry of every bike on the fort. During training, Lieutenant Harley would also show the troops some tricks they could do with their bikes to make them run and handle a little bit better. So, Harley-Davidson had a direct hand in Army motorcycle operator and repair school since 1917. In fact, To see how deep this connection was already by 1918, we need to look no further than the Army Manual, Regulations for Motorcycle Transportation, Quartermaster Corps, U.S. Army, compiled by the Motor Division of the Quartermaster Corps, published by the War Plans Division in 1918. The Harley-Davidson part list is a bound part of the manual, and the Indian parts list is a printed loose supplement added after print. Finances also, of course, need to be considered. Simply comparing bike to bike, the per unit price for an Indian 640B cost the government more than a Harley-Davidson WLA. The WLA was the outcome of motorcycle mods and joint Army manufacturer testing since 1937. Harley-Davidson learned in this stage what was needed, and by 1941 had set up a very efficient and cost-reduced manufacturing line for the WLA. With the cost plus incentive, when companies would manufacture for defense, the government would basically cover the cost of setting up the equipment needed to produce an expected amount. Then the profit margin was capped at, say, a rate like 10%. Harley-Davidson was able to grow because of this, even after the war. The 45 cubic inch flathead was produced by Harley-Davidson until 1973. Indian, however, did not grow stronger during the war, despite their production efforts. A point that anyone who studies the history of the Indian Motorcycle Company knows is the questionable management decisions were always the hallmark of this brand's history. And although I am not qualified to present a lecture in business management, I will say that Indian did not have the best of luck with that in the many years before World War II, and the war did not bring about any helpful changes. Here's another factor in the Army's decision to have reservations about the Indian for overseas duty. All of the 640Bs, at least what the historical record shows us, which served with U.S. troops, only served stateside. But when the military was considering sending both of these bikes overseas, this fact appeared. The shipping size of the Indian 640B was 78 cubic feet. Compare that to the Harley-Davidson WLA with a shipping size of 54 cubic feet. This means if a cargo ship held 150,000 cubic feet of cargo, you could ship almost 1,000 more WLA motorcycles than 640B motorcycles. Many factors, like the ones we've just discussed, were part of the Army's decision to phase out the Indian 640B after only purchasing 2,531 of these bikes. One of these Indian 640Bs is here at National Museum of Military Vehicles. This example has stamped numbers on the frame of 6401201, a very early frame in the 640B's production run, 1940. And on the engine are the stamped numbers FDO2337, about midway in the production for military contracts, 1941. By the time the United States enters Europe with ground forces, the 640B is no longer purchased, and Harley-Davidson WLA becomes the Liberator. Actually, that name doesn't seem to come about until after the war. The WLA becomes the bike that won the war. Probably not, unless you believe that the war was won by MPs. The WLA does, however, become the bike that is used most by the United States military during World War II. The Harley-Davidson WLA in front of me has the stamped engine numbers of 42 WLA 61105, which dates the bike's build to 1944. 42 WLA was stamped on all engine cases, regardless of the year of manufacture. Frames were not stamped. The W in Model W stood for the 45 flathead introduced initially in 1937. L for high compression engine, relative to the era, and A for Army. The fact that this was not ground-up designed for the military places the WLA behind many foreign military bikes of World War II that were specifically designed for military use, some of which included two-wheel drive, reverse gears, shaft drive. The WLA was never going to be able to conduct the legendary blitzkrieg capabilities of German bikes during World War II. And though it never had to, it was supposed to have been designed for combat potential. And this potential was honestly never quite clear to the Army. For example, the reports of the 6th Cavalry Regiment during the 1940 Louisiana and Georgia maneuvers show that there were 81 motorcycles in that regiment, which covered approximately 4,000 miles. Of these 81 bikes the 6th Cavalry used during the war games, 53% of the bikes failed due to what the Army considered to be poor design, 12% from faulty operator maintenance, 22% just normal wear and tear, and 13% due to miscellaneous causes. On good roads, the motorcycle performed well, but were not suitable as a tactical vehicle. Weather and terrain made them useless in maintaining convoy speeds, and running them at low speeds caused the air-cooled engine to overheat. There's a reason why new old stock rear cylinders are harder to find than front cylinders. About 50% of the motorcycles used in the exercise had to be rebuilt. A former commander of the U.S. Army 1st Motorcycle Cavalry Reconnaissance Regiment said, "We ran into 3 problem areas with motorcycles. First, the motorcycles were made for the road and were too heavy to work effectively off the road. Second, employed off the road, the cycles could not keep up, and as a result, spent the largest amount of their time in the back of a truck. Third, they were not mechanically sound." The after-action conclusions were, motorcycles in their present state of development are entirely unsuited for military purposes, except for use in messenger work, traffic control, and the like. Even for these uses, they should be radically redesigned. The pre-war U.S. Mechanized Cavalry Reconnaissance Regiments wanted to replace the horse, which could not keep up with the faster-moving vehicles. When these units began dehorsing, it was believed for a brief moment that the motorcycle had the speed of mechanized cavalry with the cross-country mobility of the horse. This did not prove to be the case. Compounding the problem prior to World War II was the fact that the Army was developing an off-road capability for most of its other vehicles by converting them to four-wheel drive. According to Major General George Lynch, the overweight motorcycle was the only tactical vehicle in the Army's inventory that could not leave the road without great difficulty. Because the motorcycle could not go where other Army transportation went, it became practically useless in the field. The reality was that the U.S. motorcycle, regardless of the hope and intent, was nowhere near as capable for the job as the quarter-ton Jeep. An Army board concluded in 1941, the weight of the vehicle made it difficult for one man to handle off the road. It was excessively noisy. It had no capability of communication en route or on the move. Night operations under blackout conditions were extremely hazardous for the driver. Its use was limited on snow and ice. No sufficient firepower capability. The conclusion was, upon unanimous recommendation of the principal services, further procurement of current types of motorcycles beyond those urgently needed for immediate training purposes as traffic control vehicles will stop. That is why I say that the only way the WLA earned the title the Liberator or the bike that won the war is if you believe that MPs and couriers won the war. Now, of course, I'm not saying only MPs use the WLA. Like so many other service members, to this day, our troops during World War II did complete tasks with equipment unsuitable for the mission. And there are rare stories of the WLA being used by U.S. troops in direct combat areas. And of course, the Russian Army's use of the WLA in combat is well recorded. So even though the WLA was not the king or queen of battle, it is still a favorite bike of mine here at the museum. Look, in the end, both are good bikes and very similar, but the differences were enough to cause the Army to throw their favor behind the WLA. And I agree. For military purposes of the era, considering parts, wear, PMCS of the bike, I would rather have the WLA. Like a lot of you, I have an undeniable interest in World War II motorcycles. The muscle bikes of the battlefield, the BMW R12 and the R71, the BSA M20, the Russian M72, the little DKW 125, and even the over-engineered and overhyped Kettenkrad. We will be reviewing all of these motorcycles in multiple videos, but I'm not done with Indian or Harley-Davidson. we have an Indian 841, and for Harley, we have a UL 74 cubic inch flathead that was sent to South Africa during World War II. Thanks again for watching. Subscribe to the channel to catch those videos.